Okay, in October 2022, Harrison Chase pushed the first lines of code to a little open source package called LangChain. There was no company, there was no business model. Really, this was basically just a little wrapper to help people do useful work with language models. Fast forward 3 years, LangChain has just raised $125 million at a $1.25 billion valuation, officially now becoming a unicorn. And this is their Series B. Before this, they raised a bunch of money from Sequoia and from other VCs as well. And to coincide with this 3-year birthday, they're also dropping LangChain 1.0 and LangGraph 1.0, which both have gone through a lot of changes over the past 3 years. And now LangChain is sort of positioning themselves as being the platform for agent engineering. So in this video, I want to talk about some of the things that are new. I also want to talk about, is this justified, or is this sort of a real sign that we are in the AI bubble that everyone keeps talking about? And I'd love to hear from all of you in your comments what you think about LangChain becoming a unicorn, and how does this bode for the other agent frameworks that are also out there on the market now. Okay, so in late October 2022 is when Harrison first dropped the package that sort of was LangChain, very early version. I think they even mentioned in here that it was only about 800 lines of code. I remember checking out about 2 weeks later after it came out that I'd seen people talking about it, and I sat down and sort of had a play with it. Back then, I thought it was really on track for a lot of things that it was doing. In many ways, it really kind of blew up because it let normal devs that perhaps didn't know anything about what we would call nowadays context engineering be able to put together these string of prompts. And it kind of made sense back then, the name LangChain, in that these were chains of prompts being put together to get language models to do what you actually wanted them to do. So don't forget, at this stage, probably the best model out there was sort of like a GPT-3 kind of model. This was just before ChatGPT came out. We didn't have things like tool calling, structured outputs, and stuff like that we take for granted now when building LLM apps. But I think even then, people were starting to think that, yes, it would be good to have some kind of library, some kind of framework for being able to deal with LLMs. And over that 6 months that followed it, as models like Llama came out and other open models, people wanted some kind of framework that could work both with, say, OpenAI, with some of the Hugging Face models, with other models that were starting to come out from other providers. So I think I first met Harrison and the very small LangChain team around September 23. And at that stage, obviously, they had taken off quite a lot. They'd formed the company earlier that year. They'd raised some money, they had some offices, and they were really starting to march ahead with rolling these things out. And back then, I think even Harrison would say that nobody really knew exactly how these things were going to play out. I remember a conversation that we had at a bar in San Francisco where Harrison and us were all wondering what was going to be announced at the OpenAI Dev Day. And at the time, they were wondering how those kinds of things were going to impact the library. Since then, I've spoken to Harrison a couple of times. And I remember speaking to him last year where he was talking about how much his role was moving towards running the startup and doing the day-to-day CEO position. And he's clearly done a fantastic job of that. For LangChain to become sort of the first unicorn, as far as I know, they're the first real unicorn agent platform. You got to give him credit for being able to execute at making these things happen. So it's not just the fact that they've raised so much money at such a high valuation. It's also interesting to see that they've got a lot of prestigious investors now, including Sequoia, that's invested in many companies, Benchmark that goes back to companies like eBay, Uber, etc. And even Capital G, which actually is one of the VC arms of Google, have invested in this. It's also very interesting to see in this announcement that they talk about that they're powering the AI teams at places like Harvey, Rippling, Cloudflare, Workday, and big companies like Cisco. And you do see them really stressing this whole thing about we are building the platform for agent engineering. So along with the raising information, they also talk about the future of where things are going for them as a company. And that really this seems like it's splitting out to 3 main products. So they have their open source frameworks, both LangChain and LangGraph. I'm going to come back to those and deep dive on those in a second. But they've also got Langsmith, which seems to me is probably the way that they're making money. Langsmith launched quite a while ago now. It was really for tracing and observability, allowing people to see what were the inputs going into LLMs, what were the responses back, how was it using tool calls, how was it using function calling, all those sorts of things. And that space has gotten quite crowded over the past 18 months, where we've seen lots of startups getting into this sort of observability and tracing kind of stuff. Along with that, Langsmith is also going to run your sort of deployments. Formerly, this was LangGraph platform. It seems to have been folded into Langsmith. The idea here is that this is basically creating the infrastructure to be able to run your code in the cloud, to be able to handle things like human in the loop, long-running agents, all these sorts of things, and hooking them up to data sources, to tools, to MCPs, that kind of thing. The fourth thing, which is totally new to Langsmith, is the whole idea of an agent builder, which is kind of curious considering that LangChain and Harrison were quite critical of OpenAI's agent builder just a couple of weeks ago. But I guess that's to be expected in many ways. Currently, the agent builder is only in private preview, so we don't know a lot about it. I haven't seen it myself, but it does seem that like the goal there is to create something that's sort of like a no-code tool that allows people to be able to do this. So we've seen Crew AI do this. Obviously, we've seen OpenAI do this very recently. And in many ways, you've got to think that these coding platforms really have to have something to counteract the platforms like N8N, like Opal from Google, which seems to be growing fast as well. And you can imagine it's probably going to be easier to get customers if you can sell both the sort of fully code heavy version of building agents, as well as a compatible no code tool, which people in an organization can use as well. The other part of the announcement, which is kind of interesting, is that LangChain themselves are launching their own agent. So this is a insights agent. It seems to be an agent that runs in Langsmith and allows you to sort of get that agent to check things in traces and stuff like that. It seems very similar to something that I saw earlier this year from the Arise AI Phoenix team. All right, so the area that's probably going to affect most people from the announcements this week are the rollouts of LangChain 1.0 and LangGraph 1.0. So they talk about these as being the first major versions of the frameworks. Obviously, LangChain has iterated now for 3 years, and LangGraph has been around for quite a while as well. It does seem here that they're actually making some key changes to both of these frameworks. And more than that, they're actually sort of defining the key differences between the frameworks and how you should think about them going forward. So first off, they talk about both these frameworks serving different purposes. LangChain, which originally was more for sort of chains and workflows and prompt engineering, or what's now being called context engineering, they're now defining this as the fastest way to build an AI agent. And that this basically has the standard tool calling architecture, the agnostic design, and it's kind of like the higher level, simple, often maybe frustratingly, things like prompts are going to be hidden from you, etc. But the whole thing is going to be easier to do than LangGraph. LangGraph is the low-level framework, what they're calling the runtime for customizing all of these things and to be able to really control where it's actually going. So I like to talk about LangGraph as being on rails, meaning that you can very strictly tell it what it's allowed to go and do and what it's not allowed to go and do. And I think while a lot of the agent frameworks are starting to get this idea of really giving the programmer sort of full control, a lot of them still just leave it all up to the LLM, rather than treating the LLM as kind of like a function call that you get to make a specific decision, etc. So one of the biggest things that LangChain itself has always suffered from over probably the past 2 years or so is that they were constantly adding new ways to do things based on research papers that were coming out. And that was great if you wanted to try something out like a research paper that you'd seen, but suddenly they had so many different abstractions of how to do things, mini versions of workflows that were kind of hidden. They ended up with lots of different packages. And I think that they really rethought this with the 1.0 release. So they talk about here, LangChain's abstractions were sometimes too heavy. The package surface area had grown unwieldy. These are all things that a lot of people complained about LangChain, and rightly so. I kind of feel that this is the area that they've had the biggest frustrations, is that you often end up writing so much code to be able to do things that should be really simple, or you end up trying to work out what they've actually done in the background to hide the prompt and to work out where different things are, etc. So it is interesting to see how this is going to play out. And I think what I will do is make some videos about these things in depth rather than go through them too much in this video. They seem to have really stuck to the whole create agent abstraction. Basically, this is where you've got something going into a model. The model can then call tools. It will get the results back and then can decide whether it calls tools again or whether it goes to the final result out. And obviously you can string multiple ones of these together. The other thing that they've brought to enhance this, which I do think is really interesting, is this whole area of middleware. Now, this definitely deserves a video by itself, which I will try and get around to making. But the idea here is you've got a bunch of hooks that allow you to customize that kind of loop that's going on and what's actually going on in that. And this allows you to have more control at each step that the agent actually takes. So interestingly, they've built a number of middlewares for common use cases, but from everything I can see so far, you can go out and build your own that are going to be really specific. They've made a standard human in the loop kind of thing, which is definitely a pattern that people need to be working on now for agents. Any sort of deep agents, any sort of research agent where something's coming back to you, that kind of thing, is using this kind of pattern. Also, the whole idea of summarization or compacting patterns around reducing the size of your context window. So compacting the context that you're actually putting through here is an interesting one. And the third one, which I know people are using in enterprise, this is a really important thing, is the whole sort of PII redaction, basically redacting things like names, addresses, emails, all these kind of things that allow you to comply with not sending customer data to a LLM provider. Now, they've got a nice simple diagram here showing how this works and showing sort of the different places you can call this middleware, which kind of makes sense that you can think about these as callbacks for running particular operations like the ones we just talked about. And then the other two key areas that they talk about is this whole sort of standard content blocks for dealing with model outputs. And finally, they're reducing all the different areas of the package, which actually that I think is a really big win for them. And I'll certainly return to this as I'm conscious that just this morning I looked and it's like over a year since I've actually made a video about something to do with LangChain. And yet I still get people asking questions about it every week. So the changes to LangGraph 1.0 seem to be more just sort of refining what LangGraph has actually been and is supposed to be. The idea of persistence of building these things in, my guess is that is going to integrate very heavily with their own deployment options as well. And with, again, these human in the loop patterns that are becoming really important in sort of building reliable long horizon agents that operate for quite a while and then will often check back in with a human for some updates or to clarify a task, etc. So interestingly, they talk a lot about when to use LangChain versus when to use LangGraph. So they talk about LangChain being for basically when you want to ship something quickly, when you've got a real sort of standard thing of that you've got model tool response, which is the whole sort of function calling paradigm. And when you want to use some of these perhaps pre-made middleware customizations and go with some of the defaults for things like RAG and stuff like that out of the box. LangGraph, on the other hand, is definitely much more of the low-level agent builder. And the idea here is you're being much more strict in what the agent can do. So you're trying to make it as deterministic as possible, and then just using agentic components or LLMs for very specific kind of calls. But like I said before, I always think of LangGraph as being on Rails. And this goes back to one of the Codium papers, which I know influenced the LangChain team a lot, was this idea of having it where you've got nodes that directly follow a sort of system. And while they can split off at different parts, you're controlling what it can actually do. And of course, that's going to be something that's going to be much better for things like long-running business process automation, anything that you want to do that's highly custom or much more sort of complex workflows, and things where you want to be really on top of latency. You want to be on top of all the different parts of the agent, as well as the overall result. So just to finish up, a third piece that they released was the Reflections on 3 Years of LangChain, written by Harrison himself. Interesting read if you're into sort of any agent framework. It's got some interesting takes on how things have changed over the 3 years. And I really think with this third birthday announcement, LangChain has become a lot more relevant than perhaps it was 6 months ago. For the past year or so, I haven't recommended people use LangChain for production deployments. But at the same time, I've recommended that people should learn to use LangChain because they show you all the different patterns that people are using to build LLM apps. And I think I certainly need to sort of revisit this and see how this compares now to some of the more recent frameworks like Google's ADK, like Pydantic AI, and even some other frameworks like Llama Index, which have updated a lot. And to be really honest, I just haven't been able to keep up with. Overall, I think Harrison and the other founders of LangChain, the whole team, definitely deserve a huge congratulations for this. It's a major event in this progression of LLMs going through to agents. LangChain is clearly trying to stake out their ground for being the orchestration level of all of this kind of software. I'll certainly be revisiting some of the things that they've got in here. I'd love to hear from people in the comments. Is there anything specific about these things you would like me to show building some stuff like that? I just recently gave a big talk about deep agents and the whole concept of deep agents in different frameworks. I might actually record a version of that for YouTube. I do think there's some really interesting patterns that we're seeing around these sort of long-running agents that have things like file systems, sub-agents, a whole bunch of different things that we're seeing in here. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, if you found the video interesting, please like and subscribe, and I will talk to you in the next video. Bye for now.